continue to read this book. The ruthlessness. The ruthlessness of atheists. So have you ever heard of the big lie? It's a suppression that was first coined by Adolf Hitler in his 1925 book, Mein Kampf, and it was used to describe the propaganda technique that he successfully employed to capitulate the Nazi Party into power and then to maintain control of the German people for more than a decade. It's based on the idea that while small lies are easily exposed, refuted, and rejected, big blunted lies can often seem more credible. If presented in the proper way, the reason is that good people have trouble believing anyone would even attempt to tell a lie that's enormous and obvious untrue. Therefore, if that lie is repeated often enough and with sufficient conviction, the people who hear it will actually begin to question their own powers of judgment and start to believe what they intuitively know to be untrue. It's fascinating and evil concept, and it's worth listening to Hitler himself explain it. In the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility because of the broad masses of a nation are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature. They consistently are voluntary, and thus in the primitive stability of their minds. They more readily fall victim to the big lie, and then the small lie, since they themselves often tell small lies in the little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. It would never come into their heads to fabricate cultural untruths, and they would not believe that others could have the units to distort the truth so infamously, even though the facts which prove this to be so many be brought clearly to their minds. And they will still doubt and waver and will continue to think that there may be some other explanation. For a grossly impudent lie always leaves traces of believability behind it, a fact which is known to all expert liars in the world and all who conspire together in the art of lying. These people know only too well how to use falsehood for the basic purposes. These techniques of deception, though conceivable by Hitler, was refined and put into practice on a massive scale by Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, who famously wrote, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it, and the lie can be maintained only for such a time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, or military consequences of the lie. If thus becomes readily important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the moral enemy of the lie, and thus by extension the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. Thus, according to the main orthodox of the big lie, this method of propaganda works best if the following three elements are in place. Number one, a huge classical lie, and number two, constant repetition of the lie to a mass audience, and number three, suppression of the truth through a climate of fear. The most effective application of the technique, of course, took place in the 1930s against the Jewish people. Goebbels making use of the mass media available at that time, including radio, movies, billboards, and high-speed printing and distribution of magazines and newspapers, told the lie that Jews were subhuman, and that they were evil incarnate, and that they were responsible for all the common hardships being experienced by the German people. Obviously, this was absurd, but the Nazi propaganda machine working in tandem with the mass media went into the full gear, repeating the lie in every possible way. They convinced the German people that the Jews were poisoning society and were responsible for every evil imaginable. And the only way humanity could be saved was to rid itself of Jewish influence. And we all know what the final solution to this problem entailed: the extermination of the Jews and the Holocaust. It wasn't until the Allies crushed the Nazi army in 1945 and pictures of the concentration camps were shown to the German public that the big lie was finally exposed. But while the forces of good triumphed in the World War who the big lie technique didn't disappear with the Nazis. It was utilized many times in the 20th century with deadly results. And unfortunately, it was being used today in an effective manner by you guessed it, our friends, the news atheists. In that last chapter, we looked at the constant refrain that religion is responsible for more deaths, bloodshed, and war. Is another singer factor in history. That charge is shouted from the hilltops by atheists everywhere and then trumpeted by their sympathizers in the entertainment industry, the media, and the academic world. It's even familiar to school children who are taught very early about the Crusades and the Inquisition and many other so-called crimes against humanity perpetrated in the name of God. We have something to say about those infamous events shortly, but the first point to make clear is it's a lie, a big wanted, bald-faced lie. Religion is not the cause of most of the wars that have taken place. It is not the cause of most of the murders that have taken place. It's not the cause of most of the bloodshed that has taken place. To even suggest such a ridiculous thing is to display in ignorance of history, tantamount to imbecility. The number one cause of war and bloodshed on this planet was, and always will be economic gain. And one country or city or town wishes to take control of another's wealth and attempts to do so through force. Violent conflict ensues and people die. In ancient times, the economic benefit might have been gold or silver or precious jewels or land or tools or livestock or slaves. In modern times, the economic benefit usually takes the form of oil or technology or machinery or resources for manufacturing. No matter the specific object to be gained, the underlying motive is always the same: money. And next to economics, and often connected with it, the most common cause of the war and bloodshed in the world has been territorial gain. One country or city or town comes to the conclusion that it desperately needs more land, either for economic reasons such as agriculture or oil, or because it wants more living space such as the Nazi invasion of its neighboring countries, or the creation of buffer zones between enemies such as in the Middle East or the Hurricane. These are the two main reasons for violent conflict in human history and nothing else, and they are worldly in nature, not religious. Beyond these principal kinds of wars happen civil or revolutionary. Within a given country, eternal disagreement arises to how the nation should be governed. Passions are inflamed in war and the carnage follow, or perhaps a segment of the population revolts against its rulers for the purpose of changing the leadership or to gain self-determination. Civil and revolutionary wars account for a vast number of bloody conflicts that have taken place on this planet, and almost all of them pertain to gaining political power, and very few have been about religion, faith, or God. In fact, when the stated purpose of a war is ideological in nature, its underlying cause is usually civil, revolutionary, economic, or territorial. And for example, France and England have gone to war countless times over the centuries. But do you really think for one second that the reason is that the English are Protestant and the French are Catholic likewise? Even though there was much talk during the American Revolution about fighting for the noble cause of inalienable rights, is there any question that the main reason the colonialists rebelled against Great Britain was to gain political and economic freedom? Even the Israeli-Palestine conflict today cannot truly be said to be religious in nature. And yes, both parties make claims that God has given them a particular parcel of the land. But the conflict is clearly a dispute over self-determination and the ownership of a specific geographical territory. The rare rivalry, as any student of history or geopolitics knows, is ethnic rather than religious. The point is that it's preposterous to claim that religion has caused most of the wars in history when even a cursory curiosity glance at history shows otherwise. According to Philipson, Alexar's Free Realm Encyclopedia of Wars, which chronicles such 1,763 wars that were waged between 8,000 BC and AD 2000, and 123 can be classified as religious in nature. And this represents the 698% of all wars that have ever taken place. If you subtract Islamic wars from the equation, the percentage falls to a tiny 3.23%. And how on earth can atheist history complain that Christians have caused so much bloodshed when they account for less than 4% of all of humanity's wars, while over 90% have been caused by other factors? Bear in mind, we haven't even talked yet about the number of war casualties. If you look at a list of all the violent conflicts that have taken place in history, from the Vietnam War to the World War II, to the Chinese Civil War, to the Mexican Revolution, to the Napoleonic Wars, to the Mongol Quest, you'll see that the overwhelming majority of people killed were the victims of governments and not religions. Rudolf Rommel, the renowned professor of political science who spent his entire career studying the data on collective violence in war, coined the term to democide to describe the all-pervading history or phenomenon of the murder by the government. According to Rommel, in the last history years alone, almost 170 million men, women, and children have been shot, beaten, tortured, knifed, burned, starved, frozen, and crushed or worked to death, buried alive, drowned, hung, bombed, or killed in any other of the myriad ways governments have inflicted death on helpless citizens and foreigners. The dead could conceivably be nearly 360 million people. It is as though our species has been devastated by a modern black plaque. And indeed, it has, but a plaque of power, not germs. Ranked according to death toll, 3 of the 10 bloodiest wars of all time were waged in the 20th century: World War I, World War II, and the Second Sino-Japanese War. World War II alone fought between 1939 and 1945 easily surpassed all other war death tolls, with upward of 70 million people killed. Do atheists really need to be reminded that World War II had nothing to do with religion? But it gets worse. The bloody figures we mentioned only demonstrate the obvious fact that when it comes to war, worldly causes like economics and politics were outnumber religious ones. But what if we go deeper? What if we look at the atheist leaders? And examine what happens when they are in power. What if we cynically look at the wars and mass murders that have occurred during the reign of godless religions and see how they compare to religious wars? And here we will discover why atheists are always so content to remain obvious to history. Here we see one of the main reasons for the big lie about war and religion. The truth is, atheist-based philosophies and leaders bear the blame for the vast majority of deaths caused by war and mass murder in the world. Just take a look at the related list of some infamous non-religious dictatorships of the recent past. Joseph Stalin, Soviet Union, 42,672 killed. Mao Zedong, China. Here's a list. I don't want to say the numbers. According to Stefani Cordius in his book, The Black Book of Communist Atheists, communist governments killed more than 100 million people in the 20th century alone. Ex-atheist Theodore Beer agrees there have been 28 countries in the world history that can be confirmed to have been ruled by the regimes with avowed atheists of the helm. of whom more than half have engaged in the genocidal acts of sort committed by Stalin and Mao. The total count for the 90 years of 1917 to 2007 is approximately 148 million dead at the bloody hands of 52 atheists. And let's just examine up two dictators, Joseph Stalin, who rose to power in the Soviet Union in 1927 and remained General Secretary of the Communist government until his death in 1953, tops everyone's list of all time murderers. Stalin was, of course, in the war avowed atheist. As a dictator, he promoted atheism through the education system, the anti-religious propaganda, entire anti-religious demonstrated discrimination laws, the creation of illegal of militant atheists, and most importantly, a barbaric and bloody campaign of persecution against believers that he relentlessly pursued for 25 years. Under the atheist regime, all religions in Soviet Union, including the Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Catholic Church, Islam, and Judaism, were violently oppressed. Monks were killed, nuns were raped, and hundreds of churches, synagogues, mosques, and monasteries and temples were desecrated and burned to the ground. Stalin didn't limit his persecution to believers. He killed everyone who posed a threat to the power during his dictatorship. He persecuted a reign of terror unmatched in the annals of history, with the mass of execution, purges, and exiles to gulag labor camps. He also methodically engineered famines on the vast tracts of the land in the European for the specific purpose of destroying the people there who sought a penance from his rule. As a result, close to the 7 million peasants died in this farming era, once known as the breadbasket of Europe. The total death toll under the Stalin is difficult to estimate, but most historians put it between 40 and 60 million people. And now let's look at Hitler. And you sometimes hear atheists make the ludicrous claim that Hitler was a Christian. Stupid. But that's just another lie. Hitler, as we've seen, was the inventor of the big lie and master of propaganda. During his early rise to power, he pondered the Christians in the same way he pondered to anyone he thought could help him achieve his objective. Basically, Hitler wanted to use religion to enable him to gain power, to subvert it for political reasons, and then to eliminate it after his third reach had been firmly established. Indeed, once Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, he began a brutal campaign of persecution of the church, imprisoning and killing large numbers of Catholic priests and bishops as well as Protestant leaders. Anyone who persists in the ridiculous belief that Hitler was a Christian, how could he be a Christian? He murdered all them people. Christian has only to read some of his private conversations first published in 1953 by Ferris, Strauss, and Young. Here are some of the quotes from their father. The heaviest blow that ever struck humanity was coming out of Christianity. The barbarism is Christianity, a legitimate child. Both are inventions of the Jew. National Socialism and religion cannot exist together. The reason why the ancient world was so pure, light, and serene was that it knew nothing of the two great scourges, the pox and Christianity. Christianity is an invention of sick brains. Our epoch will certainly see the end of the disease of Christianity. As the numbering documents clearly reveal, Adolf Hitler embraced the atheist tenets of fellow German Friedrich Nietzsche. It was the Nietzschean belief in the superhuman combined with a ruthless Darwin view of social politics that led Hitler to think he could create a German master race. Simply put, he believed that large populations could be genuinely improved by the use of selective breeding, which requires the elimination of inferior races and blood strains in order to purify Germans' people. Automatically, this delusion led to the extermination of approximately 6 million Jews and 4 million people from other religions deemed inferior by the Nazis. And when you add in all the other lives lost in World War II, the total figure comes to more than 20 million human beings killed as a direct result of the one atheist martyr. The historical evidence is clear in a long catalog of human atrocities. Atheism has produced a body count second to none, and this is neither speculation nor BS opinion. It is a controvertible fact. But what about the Crusades? The atheists cry predictably. What about the equation? Atheists have been whining about the Crusades and the equation for 800 years. And let's talk about those two events for a second. The Crusades were a series of 9 wars that took place between the years 1095 and 1272. The objective of these wars was to reclaim the Holy Land, which had been captured by the Muslim forces several hundreds of years before. And during the sack of the city of Jerusalem, Muslim armies have destroyed 300 churches and monasteries and mercilessly persecuted the Christian population. In the decades that followed, many other lands in Europe and Northern Africa fell to Islamic aggression. And finally, the Pope Urban II called on Christians to act militarily. Basically, the Crusades were fought to take back something the Christians believed had been stolen from them. And they, born out of the violent aggression of the Middle Islam, and were essentially defensive in nature. And now many wars in history have been defensive. When the United States declared war on terrorism in the early 2000s, it was responding to what it considered an unprovoked attack on the World Trade Center. The objective was not to seize Muslim lands, but rather to protect the U.S. citizens and their property. You may disagree with American policy and its motives, but the war on terror cannot be dismissed as a simple act of aggression against poor and innocent foreigners. Any thinking person would concede that it was more complicated than that. The same thing can be said for the Crusades. Though atheists and anti-Christian historians love to condemn these wars as comprehensively evil, the truth is more complex. The Crusaders claimed to be fighting a war of self-defense against violent Muslim aggressors, and they claimed to be fighting a just war. Nobody can be completely sure of a historian event's fine details, but considering the kind of Muslim aggression that still exists in the world today, why is it so hard to believe? The Spanish Inquisition is also more complicated than the atheists portray it. 2 Catholic mantras of their resilience. Further into it is about I established the equation as a core of law in order to identify and penalize a group of people known as conversos, Jews and Muslims who pretended to be Christian for political and social gain, but were secretly practicing their real religions. Though it's undoubtedly true that innocent people were persecuted and killed during the equations, certain mitigating factors must be kept in mind. First, the equation began in the year 1478, and more than 500 years ago, when reliable workers were not so easy to come by, and second, when it was established as a state of institution, not a religious one, and further severely has been greatly aggravated by anti-religious bigots whose real agenda is to use it as a stick for a Catholic bastion. According to Henry Cameron, author of the Spanish equation, the history revising the common picture we have of the equation as a colossal Holocaust perpetrated by the church is unquestionably a myth, and the typical image of the all-powerful torture. Mad collectors behind it is largely an invention of certain 19th century fundamentalists, Christian authors who wanted to discredit the papacy. The actual number of the people charged with the crimes by the Spanish equation was between 100 and 150,000. The actual number of people sentenced to death was only about 3,000. Of these, none was executed by the church, but only by the state. Moreover, these deaths took place over the course of 350 years, and some historians contend that an additional 100,000 died in prisons due to the malnutrition or illness, but there's no evidence for that. And during the same period of time, the plague wiped out a third of Europeans' population. There is just no way equally to gauge the number of deaths caused by the equation itself, only statistics are bound. The same holds true for the loss of the life during the Crusades, and an accurate account of the death toll simply doesn't exist. The common guess brings the body account to around 1 million total casualties, and 9 wars stretch over a period of 177 years, and these figures are tragic to be sure, but they simply don't compare to the death tolls of the atheist regimes we just examined. And remember, atheist tyrants of the 20th century murdered more than 100 million innocent people. Your atheists turn a blind eye to this recent and well-documented atrocity and instead persist in jabbling about events that took place eons ago under murky historical circumstances. It's no wonder they resort to big lies. The truth is too damning for them to face. But there's a deeper and more troubling question here. Why is it that atheists have been responsible for so many murders in history? Why is it that whenever an atheist regime takes the reign of power, life suddenly becomes cheap? After all, atheists claim that their philosophy is humane, because it's centered on humanity, not some make-believe God. But if that's true, why have the atheist dictators tried to destroy so much of humanity? The answer is something atheists don't want to hear. It's something they refuse to admit. And yet it's something so simple that even a child can understand. The solution to this murderous mystery is that without God, there is no final ethical judge of anyone's actions. Without God, there is no ultimate authority, no judgment day, and no moral accountability. And atheist governments have killed more human beings than any religion in history, because atheists don't believe in a God who says that killing is wrong. They don't believe in a commandment against killing. They don't believe in a commandment against anything. In short, atheists may think that certain crimes are reprehensible, but ultimately their reasons are either emotional or practical in nature, non-existential. In other words, they might believe it's wrong to commit a particular crime because they are personally repelled by it, or because they think society can function properly in an environment of rampant criminal behavior, but not because the crime is wrong in itself and of itself, and not because the crime is an act which is contrary to the very nature of God, who is goodness and truth and life. Therefore, if an atheist dictator helps to believe it's not morally problematic to slaughter tens of millions of people, and he has the power to do it, why shouldn't he? More about this point later. Beyond this, atheists don't believe in the infinite value of the human person. This is something we discussed briefly in the last chapter. Christians and Jews who are committed to their faith believe that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, and they believe that human beings have immortal souls. They believe that God loves each and every one of us, and that every one of us is therefore worth more than the entire created universe. And atheists don't subscribe to this proportion. In fact, they think it's proportionless. That's why they create ethanol systems based on savage philosophies like the social Darwinism or Nazis, Arminianism, and never on the bedrock principle that all human life is sacred. They just don't accept that principle as true. And lacking this belief in the value and dignity of human life, atheist leaders are free to do whatever they want in order to seize power and maintain control and restructure society according to whatever utopian vision of the future they happen to fancy. And that includes committing sadistic, merciless, cold-blooded acts of terror and treating human beings as worthless garbage. Yep. This might sound like a harsh judgment, but it's not. We already seen how modern day atheists are guilty of incredible ignorance and deception, especially when it comes to the blood-soaked legacy they inherited it. But we haven't even scratched the surface, and we haven't yet described how atheists have attempted to implant the third element of the big lie propaganda technique. We haven't yet discussed how they tried to suppress the truth about their furious philosophy through a climate of fear and intimidation and intolerance. But stay tuned, the worst is yet to come. So the next chapter 4 is about the intolerance of the atheists. Not seeing that, but living by one next door. Intolerant of me playing my Christian music. Intolerant of me, how I believe. And he couldn't admit that he was against that because he's a fake liar. The intolerance of the atheists. How many times have we heard atheists moan and wail about religious intolerance next to all the blood that's been shed in the name of God? This is surely their all-time favorite complaint. They love repeating in Nazism the charge that people of one religion, usually Christians, harboring nothing but animosity and hatred toward people of other religions. I know, right? Meanwhile, atheist novel creatures that they are sit back and shake their heads in despair, sadly completely in the tragedy of hate in the world, while they proclaim a doctrine that is, they assure us, infinitely more humane, lovable, reasonable, respectful, and above all, tolerant. And yes, intolerance is such an important buzzword to atheists today. Simply defined, intolerance is unwillingness to accept or endure views, belief, or behavior that differs from one. That is true because I'm witnessing that now. I think the person downstairs. I see a lot of this. Define intolerance is unwillingness to accept or endure views, belief, or behavior that differs from one's own. And an unwillingness to grant equal freedom of expression to others whose views, beliefs, or behavior different from one's own. Yeah, that's true. I see a lot of that. I need a pen. So atheists claim to vehemently oppose any kind of intolerance, especially the loathsome brand practiced by men and women of faith. And rejecting a God-centered and dogmatic view of the universe, they embrace the philosophy of secular humanism, which considers reason, science, and social justice to be the highest ideas in life. So that's why that guy puts hope in science. Thus, the atheists think that the hallmark of their own thinking is tolerance for other people and their varied points of view. After all, within a pluralistic society such as ours, there are bound to be many viewpoints that can be rationally arrived at. And in order for social justice to prevail, there must be tolerance and respect for everyone, right? But this is where things get a little confusing. Since the great majority of men and women has always believed in God, it should be obvious that religious faith must at least have some kind of rational behind it, and you might disagree with it, even passionately, but logic demands you at least admit this fact. On the basis alone, the testimony of vast populations of human beings spread across the globe and spanning of time itself, one would presume atheists could muster just a little bit of tolerance, not to mention respect for those who hold a religious point of view. And yet we do a quick survey of comments from a well-known atheist, and we see something quite astonishing. Instead of carefully reasoning arguments filled with common sense, wisdom, and understanding justice and tolerance, we find the following. Our writings and actions are sincere attempts to rid the world of one of the greatest evils religion, Jerry Kwon. If I could have waved a magic wand and get rid of either rape or religion, I would not hesitate to get rid of religion, Sam Harris says. Some propositions are so dangerous that it may be even ethical to kill people for believing them. Wow. So evil. Sam Harris. First of all, there are no great religions. They are all stupid and dangerous, and we should assault them. Beer Mayer. And all faith's claims are equally rotten, false, dishonest, and corrupt, and humorous and dangerous. Christopher Hitchens. I think religion should be treated with ridicule, hatred, and contempt, and I can claim that right. Not much tolerance here, is there? Not much respect for other points of view. Not much an attempt at understanding or individual thinking. If religion is supposedly so intolerant, why don't we ever hear this kind of ritual coming from the lips of the Pope or the Archbishop of the Canterbury, or the ethnic patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the top evangelical leaders in the United States of their chief rabbi of Israel, or the Dalai Lama, or the even most Muslim leaders? Why are atheists the ones using such sweeping generalizations in such fanatical language? What could possibly account for the stunning lapse in the secular humanism principle, this angry, misformed, brutally intolerant, and bluntly hypocritical attack on all forms of religion? Stephanie, the Georgia State Director of the organization American Atheists, reveals the truth. Sometimes intolerance becomes quite necessary. Intolerance toward beliefs and doctrines that serve only to promote hatred, bigotry, and discrimination should be lauded, as should extremist points of view toward the eradication of these beliefs and doctrines. And many people of faith are sociopaths, and quite a good number of them are psychopaths. Now it makes sense. Intolerance must be eliminated at all costs, unless, of course, it is the atheist intolerance toward the peoples of faith. Then intolerance is not only acceptable, also necessary and praiseworthy, since it serves the higher purpose of improving the human condition. Moreover, believers are just psychopaths anyway, so who cares what they think or what we do to them? Put another way, atheists are tolerant as long as you agree with them. If not, watch out. If you happen to come to a different conclusion than theirs about the existence of God, even if it agrees with what the bulk of humanity has always believed, you're nothing but a bigot and a haymonger, and therefore deserving of discrimination. Exactly. We see this kind of praiseworthy intolerance on display, its most chilling and frightening form, when atheists question the rights of parents to raise their own children in faith. For instance, Richard Dawkins asks, it's one thing to say people should be free to believe whatever they like, but should they be free to impose their beliefs on their children? Is there something to be said for society stepping in? And what about bringing up children to believe manifest falsehoods? Sam Harris agrees, when we find reliable ways to make human beings more generally enraptured by the fact of our appearance in the cosmos, we will have no need for divisive religious myths. Only then will the practice of raising our children to believe that they are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or Hindu be broadly recognized as a ludicrous absurdity that it is. In the psychologist and Professor Nicholas Humphrey Chimes and Children are argue have a human right not to have their children's minds crippled by exposure to other people's bad ideas. And no matter who these people are, we should no more allow parents to teach their children to believe, for example, in the little truth of the Bible. And generally, centrality in neurosciences at Northwestern University of Feinberg's School of Medicine asserts religion should remain a private endeavor for humans, adults. An appropriate analogy of religion is that it's kind of like porn, which means it's not something one would expose a child to. So religion is like porn. It's a ludicrous, absurdity, a manifest falsehood, and it cripples children who must be protected from their parents by the state. So much for tolerance. Of course, some atheists, such as orthodoxing us and taking more moderate pushing, writings in Huffington Post, he says, I join in the calling for regulation that restricts religious indoctrination of children until they reach, let's say, 16 years of age. Once a child hits their mid-teens, let them have it. Let them have it if religion is something that interests them. 16 years old are enthusiastic, curious, and able to rational start exploring their world with or without the guidance of parents. But before that, they are too impressionable to repeatedly be subjected to the ideas that are faith-based, unproven and historical. Route of danger, forcing religion onto minors is essentially a form of child abuse, which causes their ability to reason and also limits their ability to consider the world in the unbiased manner. and how considered that Mr. Einstein, how magnanimous and generous to grant parents the legal right to expose their children to their religious point of view once they are past the point of impressionability. Believers should count themselves fortunate to have such a fair and thoughtful advocate. No, I'm afraid the truth is clear. According to atheist, religious faith is much too dangerous to be taught to children, despite the fact that it will sustain humanity from time immemorial and given rise to art, literature, music, philosophy, education, science, and humanitarian aid. It is really just a form of child abuse. And now some atheists today think their fellow non-believers have gone a bit too far. But these sensible atheists are difficult to find. In fact, if you search the web, you'll see hundreds of atheists run sites under headings such as Christians are discussing our religion is evil. Is there such a thing as an intelligent beaver? And religions must be destroyed. Look for yourself. It is a veritable online orgy of rage. And yet, amid the oceans of venom, amid the calls for religion to be mocked, outlawed, and banned, there are a few quiet voices of sincerity that seem to represent a less militant form of atheism. These folks dissolve the anti-Christian and anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic rhetoric of foreign brands like Dawkins, Harris, and Hitchens, and they try to give credit to religion for their contribution it has made to the history of humankind on this planet. Though their efforts are greatly appreciated by people of faith, the truth is, these kind of gentler atheists are actually very naive. They don't understand the reason of their own movement. They haven't thought through the atheist potion to its logical conclusion. In their desire to admirable, they're neglected to be accurate. In fact, they miss the historical picture completely. And if they truly realized how out of touch they were with their own long tradition of intolerant hostility and violence, they would never be so foolish to think they could change the boorish ways of their atheist breeding, and that's just not going to happen. You see this climate of anger and fear that the atheists created today. Through their vicious and despiteful attacks on religion is nothing new. It's been their modus operandi for hundreds and even thousands of years. It was present at the very birth of Christianity. Remember that Jesus of Nazareth, a humble Jewish carpenter who never once held a weapon in his hands, didn't die a natural death. He was brutally executed, and he was a victim of his pagan state's intolerance toward his statements of faith. And yes, the paganism of Christ's time was not exactly the same thing as the atheists of modern times, but they resemble each other much more closely than the atheists would have us believe. The deities or gods of the ancient pagans were not at all like the God of Judaism or Christianity. They are purely mythological in nature, part of a storytelling tradition rather than a serious belief system, and they were potential rather than theological. Indeed, the pagans of Christ's time were morally aberrant in descent. Just like the atheists today, they had no belief in the personal God who created the universe. Just like the atheists today, they were pantheistic in nature, were worshipping just like the atheists today, and most important, their intolerance toward religions, especially Christianity, was of the same fierce kind of that of atheists today. The true ancestor of the Christian bashing atheists of modern times are none other than the Christian bashing pagans of equality. To understand the bewildered hostility atheists display toward religion today, we must view it through the lens of history, starting with the first Christians who were persecuted so savagely at the hands of the Roman state for hundreds of years. After Jesus Nazareth died, Christian practices were banned. Christian clergy were imprisoned, and tens of thousands of Christian families were mercilessly murdered in the arenas like the Colosseum. Writing in the year 1864, the Roman historian Tacitus described how the pagan Roman government treated the first Christians. Nero, falsely accused and is executed with the most incessant punishments. Those people called Christians who were infamous for their abominations. The ordinary of the name Christ was executed as a criminal by the perpetrator Pontius Pilate. During the reign of Tiberius, and through repressed the destruction of superstition erupted again, and not only through Judea, which was the origin of the evil, but also through the city of Rome. Therefore, first, those Pharisees who admitted their faith and then using the information they provided as a vast multitude were convicted for hatred of the human race, and perishing they were additionally made into sport. They were killed by dogs by having the hides of beasts attached to them, or they were nailed to the crosses or set aflame. And when the daylight passed away, they were used as a nighttime lamps, even though they were clearly guilty. People began to pity these sufferers. Though the writer of this account was sympathetic to the sufferings of the Christians, his language demonstrates that he, being a pagan himself, clearly believed Christians were evil and guilty of abominations, including the hatred of mankind. Indeed, it's eerie how little the tone of anti-Christian retort has changed in the 2,000 years. G.K. Charson puts it best describing those first Christian martyrs, those poor men, women, children, and infants all huddled together in the arena quietly, encouragedly waiting for the ravaging lions to be released. He said, "There shone to them on them in that dark hour a light that has never been darkened, a white fire, clinging to the group like an unearthly furnace blazing its track through the twilights of history, a lighting by which its own enemies have made it more illustrious, and its own critics have made it more inexplicable. The halo of hatred around the Church of God, the halo of hatred that describes as perfectly raging, intolerant, and implacable hatred directed toward people of faith everywhere, a hatred that is always completely out of proportion to their supposed crimes. This hatred seemed to fade somewhat during those centuries when religious belief was more fervent and when religions themselves held more power in the state, but it's never truly disappeared. It was only hiding, waiting for a chance to rear its medicine head again the moment atheists began to acquire real political power. It acquired power they did during the French Revolution. The anti-religious crusaders such as Jacques Hebert and Jacques Claude Bernard sought to begin a new persecution of religion as they attempted to completely de-Christianize France and establish a government whose official ideologically was the cult of reason. And to accomplish this goal, French radicals encouraged the destruction and desecration of churches and cathedrals for the purpose of transforming them into temples of reason. The so-called Reign of Terror, which began in 1793, was marked by mass executions of enemies of the revolution, including Christians. The Catholic Church has opposed the revolution, which had sought to turn the clergy into employees of the state and require them to take an oath of loyalty to the new French government. This new government, atheistic and extreme, persecuted and executed thousands of believers, and the death toll is estimated of 40,000, with 16,000 killed by guillotine and another 25,000 in summary executions across France. As many as 300,000 French men and women were arrested during a 10-month period between September 1793 and July 1794. Besides the guillotine, the atheist leaders of the French Revolution utilized other methods of execution, including the notorious practice of republican marriages, which involved stripping couples naked, tying them together to a log, and then drowning them. It's important to understand that the perpetrators of these heinous crimes were not unintelligent street rabble. They were journalists, they were politicians, they were educated ajadi, I don't know that word, ideologues, whose thinking was characterized by a philosophy of Milton atheism. The same philosophy as espoused by men like Augustine, Comte, Ludwig, Freiburg, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche. And not only did these atheists publicly denounce belief in God, but also they shared a white-hot hatred of religion and argued forcefully that it was humanity's solemn duty to destroy religious conviction altogether. And to oppose this destruction, they claimed was an act contrary to reasoning and historic progress. Tolerance was not part of their vocabulary. It was these atheist philosophers of the 19th century who laid the ideological foundation for the atheist political leaders of the 12th century, and their intolerance for religion and religious principles set that stage for the bloodiest wars and mass murders ever to take place on the stage of human history. And remember what we discussed in the last chapter, atheist freedoms of the 20th century, which included the sovereign unit over the Lenin and Stalin, China under Mao Zedong, all these weird names. Zedong, Abiel, Albania under Enver Hoxha, and Cambodia under the Khmer Raj brutally murdered more than 100 million people. 100 million people don't pass over the figure quickly. Look at it, think about it. Moreover, 100 million people wiped out, all forms of religion brutally suppressed, churches and synagogues discredited and destroyed, all by militant atheists. And what was the reason for this carnage? The Christians and Jews who were slaughtered didn't commit any crimes. They were They weren't plotting revolutions. They weren't trying to amass political power. They weren't attempting to overthrow dictators. And their only offense was practicing their religion. They believed their first alliance belonged to God, not the state. And that is why the atheists who control the state butcher them. Indeed, that's what always happens when atheists control the state, whether it was from the decadent emperors of pagan Rome or the French followers of the cult of reason, or the godless dictators of the 20th century. Militant atheists showed their intolerance for people with other points of views by murdering them. And that's why any effort to promote a tolerant atheist today is futile. Tolerance is part of the big lie. It doesn't exist. The atheist statements we studied earlier about the obligation of state to restrict the rights of parents to raise their own children are the tip of the iceberg. And that has atheists gained more political power and exercised more control over media, academia, and the entertainment industry. Their attacks on religious freedom always grow more blunt and egregious. It's a part of who they are. Indeed, modern day persecution of religion by atheists has already begun, and the evidence is all around us. For the last 50 years in America, religious symbols, imagery, and sentiment have been systematically purged from the public square. Any kind of prayer, even non-domination and silent prayer, has been forbidden in public schools. Quotations from scripture, even the Ten Commandments, have been removed from courts and federal buildings. Government employees are no longer permitted to express themselves by hanging religious signs in their workplaces, but they are completely free to hang any other kind of non-work related secular signs. Postage stamps commemorating religious holidays and holy people are hardly ever issued. While there seems to be no end to the number of commemorative stamps featuring secular celebrities like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix and Elvis, and Will Chamberlain and Batman, and school children no longer have Christmas and Easter vacations, but rather winter and spring breaks. And during the holiday season, religious images like creatures and murderers have been eradicated from most public places, and those attempting to retain them can be sued by organizations like the ACLU and the FFRF, Freedom from Religion Foundation. Even references to the word Christmas has been increasingly censored by our adversaries. Retail schools and government offices, and while some secular aspects of Christmas, such as lighted decorations, have been retained to spur retail spending, they usually showcase only on the condition that they be associated with an unspecified holiday season rather than the birth of Christ. At the same time that this purge has taken place, atheists had mounted a relentless public relations campaign to mock the Christian faith, especially during Christmas and Easter seasons. Billboards paid for more by groups such as the American Atheists have appeared all over the United States, including the Bible Belt, with confrontation slogans such as "Who needs Christ during Christmas? Nobody." And Christianity sadistic God, useless slaver, and grow up, you're too old for fairy tales. Exactly what that person said, fairy tales. And you know it's a myth, and this season celebrated reason. Such in-your-face advertising is obviously calculated to provoke anger and to ridicule people's deepest belief at the holiest times of year. If multiculturalism is such a sacred value of secular society, where are all of the cause for sensitivity to Christian culture? Just imagine if similar billboards were posted against other religious faith, ethnic minorities, or even popular secular beliefs. They would be declared hate crimes, wouldn't they? And yet, in 21st century secular America, attacks on Christian belief go unchallenged. How could this be? A recent Russian poll reported that 76% of Americans still believe that religious symbols should be allowed on public land, and 80% believe that public schools should celebrate religious holidays in some way. If this is the case, how could America allow itself to become a nation where all religious prayers, practices, and holidays have been suppressed, while anti-religious bigotry is not only tolerated but accepted as normal? The simple reason is that many Americans have been taken in by the big lie. They've been hoodwinked into accepting that religion is somehow dangerous to the republic, and that there must be an impenetrable wall erected between it and the government. If people dare to challenge this nonsense, they're shouted down and intimidated by a loud, rude, and unrelenting chorus of hisses from a hostile atheist minority. True is the Constitution of the United States says nothing about a wall of separation between church and state. When the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, it contained the Establishment Clause, which prohibited the government from establishing any state religion. But there is a huge difference between establishing a state religion and totally excluding religion from the state. The framers of the Constitution didn't want the federal government to set up some form of church or interfere with the free exercise of religion, and that was their purpose and nothing more. They're either that the placement of Christian, Jewish, or Muslim religious symbols or public property somehow a violation of the Establishment Clause is ludicrous, and the founders of this country would have considered it an obscene distortion of their intent. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson once said the legitimate powers of government attend such acts only as are injurious to others, but it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. For the last 50 years, unelected secular judges in this country have routinely abused their powers with impunity. Not only have they restricted the religious activities of the government, but they also restricted the free religious expression of people. In this book, Men in Black, the Supreme Court is destroying America radio. Most Mark Levin states the intensive and concerted effort to exclude references to religion or God from public places is an attack on our founding principles. It's an attempt to bolster a growing reliance on the government, especially the judiciary as the source of our rights. But if our rights are not inalienable, if they don't come from a source higher than ourselves, then they're mutable at the will of the state, and this is a prescription for tyranny. Tyranny. That is exactly what the militant atheist majority is always seeking to impose. And no one with any common sense really minds when people say Merry Christmas in a post office or government building. No one really feels discriminated against when they see a Christmas tree or a major scene or a address in a public square. There needs to be a state of tyranny in place for such simple expressions of pity to be suppressed. And that's just the kind of state we're living in today. It's time to face the facts. Atheists have nothing less than a totalitarian intolerance for believers, and they are determined to root out and remove any remaining vestige of Christianity from Europe and America, and even to deny parents the right to raise their own children with religious faith. And they use the same language and harboring the same ambitions as the communist regimes of the 20th century. Though they stop short of employing physical violence to establish their vision of a godless utopia, give them time. They instead driven their opponents from the public square with a lethal mixture of scorn, smears, deception, and legal intimidation. But why? What could possibly account for all this fury? What lies at the bottom of the black and fury hatred of religion? And before we can answer the question, we need to lay a bit more groundwork. We need to enter into the atheist conscience and actually try to understand the atheist mind. And when we do that, we discover two striking qualities that have the potential to shed light on a deeper, more sinister mystery of the atheist raging intolerance. These two character traits next on our list to discuss are profound moral cowardice and astonishing lack of intelligence. But I'm going to read it till tomorrow, probably, because I read 2 chapters today. Bye. I'm going to read my Bible now.